Hi, my name is Cyle Young. I am co-owner of Serious Writer and a literary agent who, in the last 3.5 years, has sold over 350 books, from children's books to fiction books to nonfiction books, all across all the markets. And we have learned a lot about helping writers create the best edited draft they can to present those books to publishers to get contracts. And so I'm going to teach you one of my favorite things that I do in this industry, which is I call the polished draft. And so we are going to talk about the polished draft, and we're going to go through 30 different steps. Now, this video that you're watching right now is the first time that I have taught the entirety of the polished draft to anyone outside of my clients. So I have taught it in bits and pieces across many conferences over the years, but I wanted to, in this class, teach you the polished draft in its entirety. Hold on for the ride, because we're going to go through 30 different steps, which I expect my authors to go to before we submit their draft to publishers. And so hopefully this will help you and help you have the best edited draft that you can as you put together your piece of fiction, narrative nonfiction, or even many of the children's works that you're working on in today's market. And so we're going to go through these starting at number one. Number one. You do the look test. This is very important for any document that I see. And as an agent, when I am looking at books, I'm looking for, does it look like a book? Many times I'll see a submission. It'll come in and it just doesn't look like a submission. Doesn't look like the person knows much about the industry or books in general. And so I'm not really interested at that point. And I can do a look test and reject books just by the basis of how a submission looks. And sometimes there's a diamond in the rough. But if you don't know how to package it properly, you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. And so do the look test. Does your book look like a book? And really when I do a look test, what I do is it's all on a Word document. So when I receive an email, I will look at the email and then I will go to the Word document and I will review the document. And the look test is simply, I will zoom out on the document and I will look at how your book and your manuscript is laid out on the pages. Does it look like a book? For a fiction, does it look like a fiction book would look? And so we'll talk some more about how that looks with white space here in just a little bit. But your book must look formatted properly and look like a book. There's all different websites and blogs that tell you about what formats are appropriate, what different Word document formatting settings, your indents, do you set up your paragraphs correctly, do you handle dialogue correctly, do you understand and know what the industry standards are so that it looks like that you are ready to be at a point where you can be agented or get a contract from a publisher. And so we do the look test. Some of what I do for the look test is that number two, I start at the beginning of sentence starts, of paragraph sentence starts. I scroll down and I look at a couple pages at a time and I just look at the first word of every paragraph. What is it? A lot of times that's a pronoun. It's he or she, or it's I, or it is the character's name. So if the character's name was Cyle, it will be Kyle, and I'll go down on every paragraph. I'll start with Cyle, the character's name, or I'll start with he, the character's name, pronoun. And so those are some simple things, or a lot of people will start with it, or they, or that. And those are not good understood ways to start. And to develop writing, we'll have a much clearer understanding of how to vary your paragraph starts with the first words of the sentences. And so I look for that. If I see the same word at the beginning of every paragraph, it's just a warning sign to me that this book, this author, is not currently ready to be represented as an agent and be submitted to a publisher, because that is a representation. Their writing is a representation of me as well, if I'm their representative. And so I look at the paragraph sentence starts. Now, how you fix them is vary them. Don't use the same sentence start at the beginning of every paragraph. I advise you to zoom out, take a look at your document. You're probably going to find out as you scroll through your document, you're going to have a lot of the same words start appearing at the beginning of paragraph starts. It's something that it's what I like to call subconscious camouflage. It's something that we do that our subconscious does not allow us to see, even though we can see it in other people's work and know that it's wrong, we can't see it in our own. And so look at the beginning of your paragraph sentence starts and then fix them. Vary them, make them stronger, and that's what you can do there. So that's the first part of the look test. The next part of the look test is I want you to do, if you're my client, I want you to do internal paragraph sentence starts. So once you've looked at the beginning of every paragraph, then go inside the paragraph and look at each sentence and see the starting word of each sentence. Because although you may fix the beginning word of every paragraph, you may actually use those same words to start the majority of your sentence. I will often see 6 or 7 sentences out of a 6 or 7 sentence paragraph start with the word he or she or the character's name. That is a common occurrence. And sometimes it'll be 4 out of 7, sometimes it'll be 5 out of 7. But even that is too much. And so when you have a great command of the ability to write, you will be able to structure sentences in such a way that they're varied in length, but they're also varied in how they start, and you use more language than you maybe have used in the past as you get a better command of really language and how to put it on page. So when you fix this, you want to take your internal paragraph, sentence starts, and within that paragraph, you want to vary the structure of each sentences. And what this does is when you do something as simple as this, it trains your brain that you have to begin to open up and expand your vocabulary of how you write sentences and how you write paragraphs, which will ultimately make you a better writer from this manuscript to the next manuscript and on as you practice that and put that in practice. Next thing I look for when I'm doing the look test, I look for white space. When I look for white space, I just simply want to see how much white is on a piece of paper. So if it's a document, I'm looking at the white and the stuff that's not text, which is the black. And I want to make sure there's enough white space, because the less white space on a page, the more dull and boring that page feels to the reader. Think about this. If you're going to the library and you're getting a resource book, a lot of those big resource books like history books, they're going to be long paragraphs, no white space, just big blocks of text. And those type of books are not thrilling to us to read. They're institutional books, they're resource books, they're books that you usually find for education or knowledge. They're not necessarily for entertainment, such as like a fiction or a narrative nonfiction would be. So when you're writing fiction and narrative nonfiction, you want to have more white space. It gives breathing room for the reader. It's easier on the eyes, and it's easier for you to read and flow because you've got the white space, so it's easier for your eyes to break apart the different parts of the text and process those words, especially as you age, and I'm getting older and starting to see my sight is going as I get older. The older you get, the more white space is helpful for you to read and see, and it's just a practical thing. So I look for a healthy amount of white space on a document. So that's my look test. And then I go into what I call the as search. After we get the look test done and we really work on the paragraphs and the sentences, then we move forward into working on some of the mechanics of grammar and writing. And I will add this caveat. When all 30 of these, you can do them all at the same time. Because some of them, it makes sense to do them at the same time. I'll give you an example here in a second. And it doesn't make the most sense to change one and then you're going back to change another one on a different review pass. Some of my clients have went through and done this in 15, 20, 30 passes, and they just do one pass looking for one thing all over the book, and they go and they work on the next one, and they go and they work on the next one. And some of them combine it into multiple passes where they'll take 3 or 4 and then go do an edit pass through the book. But when you're writing, like most people can write a manuscript. They can put a manuscript together. They can write 50,000 words, 70,000 words, 100,000 words. They can do that. But a novel is crafted in the editing process. And the best novels that you've read and the best narrative nonfiction, it's crafted in the editing and revision of that manuscript. It's often 12 passes plus is not an abnormal thing to create a beautiful and wonderful book, especially the ones you'll see that are selling and performing well, which are written with high concepts and great ideas. And so that's something to be aware of as we go through this next part. So this next phase is called, what we do is the as search. And it's simply you search the Word document for the word as. And so what I like to do is up in the search bar, I'll search for as, the word as, but I'll search for every word in the document that contains the word as. You can do it as only that word, so just the word as with a space before and after it, or you can search as any word that contains the letters A and S. I will often search both of those because I combine a later step that I'm going to mention to you at the end with this step. You can do it either way. If you want to search for just the word as as a word as, or if you want to search for the letters as within words, I'll explain that more as we get towards later in this, why you could do it that way. But for now, we'll just say you did the as search, and you search for as, just the word as throughout the document. And what that means is when you're searching for that, you will discover how many times you use the word as in a document. And one of the things that you want to do is I like to say you kill the as monsters, because the word as gets overused in our speech, and it gets overused in our writing. And generally what I do is just tell people, search for the number of times you use the word as in your manuscript, and then you'll figure out that you have a problem. Because most people are like, I didn't use it that much. And then you realize it's in your all of the time. Because when we use the words like as and then, we're essentially creating a document that's full of weaker writing, and the word as is technically means that something is happening simultaneously with something else. The truth is, in life, not everything is happening all the time for your characters. And so people will use as when they mean other words. And so what we like to do is we like to take the word as and only keep the ones that are appropriate for your document. And so you could say things like as fast as or as slow as. You can use those in your document. But ultimately, when you're using things like similes and metaphors in your work, they're for flavor. They're not for every sentence that you're writing. You put them in there in appropriate places to emphasize a point. But I don't like similes and metaphors to appear more than once every rare time, because then it just everything is as something throughout the entirety of the book. And that might work for one description, but when you use a simile or metaphor, it should be to add punch to the manuscript. It should be like, I want to drive this point home. I want to connect this to my reader. And so I'm going to intentionally use a simile or a metaphor in this framework so that when my reader hears it, or reads it, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get this. Because it brings it back to our context when something may be, especially like a science fiction book, I may not understand what the technology is, but if my reader would associate it with a similar metaphor to something else, then ultimately that's where we get the connection. So be careful when you use metaphors in your work and use them when appropriate. So when I say kill the as monsters, what we're saying is get those out of your book unless they are absolutely necessary to drive home a point. And you'll have stronger writing because we use those as crutches when we don't know what else to say or write. So we throw it into a metaphor, we're like, I'll just make this comparison, and the truth is, it's just weaker writing for us. And we'll develop our skill set as writers when we kill the as monsters in less than the amount of times we use the word as in our writing. And so some of the practical things you can do is the next one, number 7. You can do what I like to say is a sentence flip. Generally, when you use as, what you're saying is the first sentence, you're saying a first sentence then as something else, such as Cyle was tapping his podium as he was speaking. Now, that is a simultaneous action because I am doing that. So that would be inappropriate. But you can say Cyle was tapping as he tapped the podium, or speaking as he tapped the podium. You could say Cyle tapped the podium and then while he was speaking, when he was speaking. So you can take that as and replace it with other connectors, and you can just flip the sentence. Or you can make it, after you do a sentence flip, and take that, you make them two completely different sentences, such as Cyle walked on stage as he was doing his presentation. You could say Cyle did his presentation in the period after he had walked on stage. You can make these different sentences, and that's not a great example at the moment, but like you can connect these as two different sentences by usually taking that second half and flipping it in front of the other one, and then making that a complete sentence. So that's your first sentence. And then generally speaking, your next sentence will be its own sentence, and you're just taking out as. And so what we do, instead of doing that and making stronger writing with more distinct sentences, we just flow one sentence to the next by using those connectors. And what it does is it makes weaker writing for us. So we want to make sure that we are doing proper sentence flips when we're trying to edit out the word as in our. And I will say this, there are always stylistic exceptions. So when you are writing, there are appropriate times that you use the word as. Like I use as in my document when I'm writing, when something is simultaneously occurring. So if my character is simultaneously doing something, then I will use the word as. But if it doesn't have to happen simultaneously, there's most likely a different or better way to say it, which is just as strong, if not stronger, than you overusing the word as in your document. Because when you overuse metaphor, when you overuse similes, when you overuse those type of connections, what you do is you weaken your writing, and eventually people get just everything is as something else, and you just feel that. And I've read many of those documents, and when I was first started writing, I wrote many sentences like that. And so we want to make sure that we have stronger sentences as we write. And one of the ways to do that is only leave the word as in when we are stylistically in our voice trying to say something specific to drive home a description, a point, or whatever. And so there are exceptions to all of these things that I'm teaching you because we each write in our own voice. And although you can have an exception every once in a while, you can't have every one to be an exception every time, or it's just bad writing. And so that's something to be aware of. Number 9, we are adverbally challenged as a people. We use adverbs all the time when we speak, when we interact, and the truth is, adverbs are lazy. It's lazy speech, it's lazy writing. And so we don't want to be, as writers, adverbally challenged. We don't want to write in such a way that we're overusing adverbs and in place of stronger, more descriptive writing. So what we want you to do is we want to encourage you to move your ly friends to ly acquaintances. If you look at your document, you got ly endings everywhere throughout your document, which is usually your sign of an adverb, then you want to move those adverbs that you love to use to acquaintances. And I will share this. When I go to conferences and I meet with people one-on-one, generally I look at a document and I see adverb after adverb after adverb because we don't know what else to say. Because when you work and practice at writing, you get better at description of thoughts and feelings and emotions and senses, and you get better at that over time as you practice writing. When you're not as practiced, you generally move to, and I'm just using an adverb just to explain it, you generally move to overutilizing adverbs to say things that you could say differently, such as thinking and sensing verbs. And so an adverb would be something like he walked slowly. That's not interesting. Like, I know what it means when someone walks slowly, but maybe he ambled along. That's the same way as walking slowly, but it sounds much more descriptive. Like, I can picture somebody ambling, and now it gives me a different picture than he walked slowly, because walk slowly could just be any way, or he sauntered would be a more descriptive word with a more distinct understanding and gives a better picture to your reader than he walks slowly. And so we need to be careful that we don't say, like, he pet the cat gently. You could say slow strokes, his fingers stroked through the cat's hair, or he stroked the cat with slow strokes, or something like that. So just make a more descriptive way of connecting with your reader, and you give them a better picture than using adverbs. And so adverbs are always overused. That's the first thing that I critique at any critique, is I just circle adverb after adverb, and it's always adverbs. And so make sure you move your ly friends to ly acquaintances, which means there's times that you want to use adverbs. And so that's the key. There are times that you want to use adverbs. When you have an action scene, you don't want to slow down the action to figure out a more descriptive way to say something. So in an action scene or a tense scene where you're trying to move the reader and increase the pace of which they're reading, you're going to use shorter sentences, but you're also going to use more adverbs instead of having longer descriptions. So adverbs can be appropriate to use to allow the pace to quicken and to lessen the word count so you can move through scenes faster. In that use, they're appropriate. But when you're using them in regular, general, non-active, non-action, non-tense, they're way overused and just a sign of weaker writing. And especially for me, when they're used at the beginning of a book, they're indicative of that I'm going to find them on every page all throughout the book. And that just means that that person is not a polished writer yet and need to work on either crafting their book, editing their book, or working on practicing the skills necessary to finish that document. And so that's something to be aware of. Another usage opportunity not for adverbs is dialogue. There's this impassable barrier of adverbs in dialogue when you're talking about referencing a speaker. So you can say, Cyle presented the workshop slowly. That is not, Cyle said, don't pass the barrier of dialogue. His voice slowly spoke the words. Slowly there is not a great descriptor. Do not use it in dialogue tags, which is that are action beats after dialogue. We want to set a scene when we're having dialogue. And so when we have that text that is spoken by a speaker, we don't want to move into the action beats or the dialogue tags that associate and confirm who is speaking by throwing adverbs in, because when we do that, it's just a sign that we don't know what else to say. And it's a moment for you to have a win as an author when you're writing in such a way that you can drive home the point of what that person is doing as they're saying it. You can give me this great description with an action beat and really pull me into the scene and what is being said. But when you throw an adverb in there, it's just lazy and it doesn't really tell or develop the scene in such a way as to really do the best job you can do as a writer to drive home what is happening in that scene. And so do not use adverbs in dialogue. And when I'm saying in dialogue, not within the speech of the authors or your characters, because characters will often speak with adverbs. And so that is an exception. In the text of the speaker, they will speak with broken English, poor grammar, and they'll use adverbs because that's what we do as people. But ultimately, when we are associating after the quotes end, we don't want to use those adverbs at that point to describe the dialogue or to describe the action, the dialogue tag. So that's important. Don't pass that barrier. But you're allowed to do it within the text quotes. It's fine. And speaking of dialogue, the dance of dialogue occurs in our writing with unique voices. There needs to be a dialogue dance. Your characters need to have very specific voices, and they need to be able to have, when I understand who my characters are, they need to be different from each other. We can't have a book of all the exact same characters. That book is boring. I don't remember the last movie you've seen, but in a movie, everybody has a different personality. I'll use the last movie I saw was Trolls World Tour. And every troll, although they're these little animated creatures, they all have very distinct personalities, different voices, and they even get different characters with very different voices and different actors and actresses to play those roles to help develop that uniqueness. So in our dialogue, we have to have this dance of dialogue, allowing us to really feel like we're there in the conversation, listening to the conversation in the manuscript and in the novel or in the narrative nonfiction that you're writing. And so how we can do that? Number one, number 13 here, you can untag your characters. A lot of times what people will do is just do dialogue tag after dialogue tag. And dialogue tag is what you write after you're saying somebody spoke. So you can say, Johnny, you can say, hey, how you doing? Johnny said. Now, Johnny said is a dialogue tag. It's after the quotes. It just tells us that Johnny is speaking and Johnny said it. And there was a book came out that's called the Bestseller Code. And in that, they looked at all the bestsellers over time, and they found the similarities between what made books bestsellers. And they had found that 95% of dialogue tags in the best-selling books only used the words, and about 95% of the time, and they used the word asked the other part of the time. They didn't use that he chuckled, or she squealed, or he whispered. They didn't use those, because those are weak ways to describe what is happening in a scene. When those moments, you can utilize words to make this powerful impact and to really to tell me not that somebody whispered, but how do they whisper? Set the tone of the whisper so I really can be pulled in. And I could say that, and so I could say Susie leaned forward and spoke the words with a soft rasp in his ear. That's much better than Susie whispered. And so there's a ways that you can untag your characters and increase that into adding in a beat of action beat. And so when we untag our characters, we really allow us to have an opportunity to let the characters speak for themselves, especially when we have unique voices. We use tags to really let us confirm the speaker. That's what we do it. We put a tag in so that you know who the speaker is. And when I look for a book, I want to confirm the speaker. When I get to a dialogue that's back and forth, and it's just speaker and then speaker and speaker, sometimes if you get this long section of back and forth without any dialogue tags, without any action beats, it gets really confusing to remember who the speaker is. So what I like to do in an edit pass is go through and make sure when I have sections of text that are dialogue, that I make sure if I'm reading through it, I can pick out a section of dialogue and know who the speaker is. If I can't, then that's what I call confirm the speaker. You need to make sure that your readers know who's speaking at all times. You don't have to use a dialogue tag every time, because dialogue tags get overdone, they get boring, and then it makes you use the characters' names over and over again, which can be very repetitive and can look odd to a reader. And so you don't use those to allow the dialogue to go back and forth, because especially if there's only two people, you know who each and every other one is. So every once in a while, you have to confirm the speaker by adding a dialogue tag. It's an appropriate use of a dialogue tag. Just a reminder, especially in a quick active scene, just a reminder of this is who this person is. So when they're going back and forth, your reader can stay in tune with it. We want to minimize the dialogue tags we use, but we don't eradicate them from our book because dialogue tags are helpful. They're important. So don't delete all of them. Just make sure that if you're using a dialogue tag, there's a purpose to why you're doing it, whether it's confirming the speaker, you're using a dialogue tag just to speed up the scene, and you don't want to put description or layer in an action beat. And so those are some of the reasons that you would use a dialogue tag and confirm the speaker. And the other ways to charge up your dialogue is really to beat it up. So this is to add action beats in. This is if you look through and you action beat after action or dialogue tag after dialogue tag in your document, one of the things that you'll want to do is minimize those, but you want to bring back in action beats. An action beat is when you say, like, let's say this one, I'm going to dunk on you. So Cyle said while he was playing basketball. So what I could do is I'm going to dunk on you. Instead of saying Cyle said, and you got this scene where they're on a basketball court, you don't want to say Cyle said. You might say Cyle bounced the ball, or Cyle pushed the ball on the ground with force in his dribble. And so trying to set the scene like Kyle's like really saying, I'm proud, like I'm a dunk on you, and just boasting about it. So you can use this action beat to flesh out the scene and say something more than just a boring, I'm going to dunk on you, Cyle said. But you can use it or Kyle, I'm going to dunk on you, Cyle beat his chest with his offhand. And that says, wow, he's really bragging now. So there's some things that you could do. Now, I don't know if you believe that I can dunk on you or not, but that's for another workshop at a different time. But the truth is you want to beat it up the dialogue. You want to show me a scene where you can add the action beat in. And when I have dialogue in quotes, and then I immediately after that follow that sentence with an action that speaker is doing, it confirms the speaker. It confirms the speaker and ultimately allows us to know who is speaking. And that's what we can do with it. So you don't have to use a dialogue tag. You can use the action beat to really pull us in and give us more details about what's happening in the scene without having to have descriptive blocks of paragraph where you're telling me. You can show me within the dialogue by beating it up and showing me more action. And so then at the end of the dialogue, the kind of dance of dialogue, and I mentioned the having a unique voice. One of the things that I think are important is doing the blind test. Have someone read sections of your dialogue to you and make sure that when you hear it without seeing it, without reading it, because again, subconscious camouflage, you wrote the words, you know who they are, but have them read it back to you. Maybe a spouse, maybe a friend, maybe a critique partner. Do the blind test and you close your eyes and you listen. Make sure when you do that, do your speakers sound different? Just by the text that's being read in the dialogue, without action beats, without dialogue tags, do you know who is speaking? Do you know which one is who based on how they sound in their text and in the words that they use? Because that's one of the reasons why movies and books use such a variety of characters, because you should be able to know based on the words that are spoken, the grammar that is used, the diction that you describe that person using, how that person speaks. And ultimately, if your characters are unique enough, you should be able to figure out who they are. Let's just say, such as if there was a romance story I was just watching one of these on Netflix, and there's a girl from a higher class part of North Carolina island falls in love with a young man who's low class, and they're separated by class struggles, and he's more like a hillbilly, and she's more of an upper class, and so they use different words, they speak different. He definitely speaks, they're very clear and intentional in the movie to show that they're different, but yet they fall in love. It's kind of one of those star-crossed lover love stories. And ultimately, if I turn the television off and just could hear the spoken words, I would know that boy was from what I would consider a lower class part of the island, because they're being very intentional about using the words that he uses to describe everyone else and interactions, the slang that he uses, but she uses much more proper English as she speaks. And so it's just the way that we write. And if you do the blind test, you'll figure out who your readers are. And so that's the next one here. And then next, weed the word garden. So we want to weed the word garden. As you are writing, after we look at dialogue, we want to weed the word garden. And the word garden is just your manuscript. It's your garden of words. And so the problem is that any garden's got weeds. And so we want to search for weed words. And as we search for weed words are words that reappear and repeat over and over again in your document. For a lot of us, those words are the same, but we all have our own weed words. So for many of us, we use it, that, they, their. We will use words like colors, like basic colors like red and blue. We'll use start, begin. We'll use just, as, really. And so these are words that we often speak, but they end up repeating in our document. I like the word, that's one of mine. So I have to do a that search every document and go through and edit that out of every sentence. Although I think it sounds better with that in it, the truth is it's not appropriate and not a great way to write. And so I have to go do a that search when I write, so to make sure I edit those out. So we got to search for weed words. You can get a list of weed words. I have a list that I give my clients. It's got about 150 weed words on it, words that are common that show us that are weaker writing, such as adverbs should be on it. Words like started to is one, and again, mine is that. And so you have to figure out what it is for you, because we all have the words that we overuse in speech. We also overuse them in writing. And you probably know, as I said this, these are my 2 or 3 main weed words. And so you need to search for your weed words and eliminate them and really adopt a one chapter, one usage mindset. So if you've got words that you use over and over again, one of the things that you'll want to do is just use that word once per chapter at most. And so if you use the word red a lot, if red is a favorite color of yours and you use red a lot, unless you're writing The Sixth Sense where red has to appear over and over again, because you find out at the end of the movie that red was a symbol that was used throughout the movie to show us that he was dead. So if you're not using it intentionally for something like that, it's just a color, you have to find a different way to write the color, or find a different way to describe red, or different shades of red, and find a way to be more unique and creative. And so adopt a one chapter, one usage mindset. For me, I try to only use the word that when appropriate and try to limit it to one usage per chapter, which is tough. And there's, again, exceptions. But ultimately, if you try to get to once per chapter and you get to twice, but you're down from 35 times, you're going to be better off. And much better off. So really adopt a one chapter, one usage mindset, although that's not a hard and fast rule, because there are some chapters you're just going to have it once or twice, and others you're not going to need it at all. And so just really get that mindset of limiting the amount of times you use weed words. At Serious Writer, we have weed word lists. As an agent, I have a weed word list that we give out, and so you'll want to find a weed word list, or maybe look for some of our classes where we offer that, and see if you can get a weed word list to help you strengthen your document and utilize those words less in your manuscript. Next is have a contraction party. It is okay to have contractions in your book, and it actually is easier to read. There was a day and time 20 years ago when contractions weren't as popular in writing, but they are much more popular in society now. So if you have I am, make it I'm. If you have he will, make it he'll. Like, it's okay to have contractions. Have a contraction party. Go through your book. We are not, it's like British butler syndrome, it's called, when everybody speaks in this really formal, really British with big words and no contractions. Like, that's like British butler syndrome, it's called. We don't want to do that. Have a contraction party. Make your words into contractions. You can go through and do a search for like I am, or your common things that show up, like will or is, and you can search your document for those words and just go ahead and turn all those into contractions. It's not going to hurt you. And I know many of the clients that I've worked with say, well, I was always told not to make the contractions. And then when I ask them when they learned that, it was 15, 20, 30 years ago. That's just not popular anymore in writing. So it's okay to have the contractions. Go ahead and make them in your book. Again, the exception is dialogue. If you have a British butler, don't make contractions when they're speaking their dialogue. But it's okay to have a contraction in an action beat describing that dialogue, because you're separating the two things from each other. A British butler would be very formal, but in our common writing about that, depending on the time period you're writing, you might not have a contraction you may have a contraction in the text, or may not. Of course, there's exceptions for style and voice with all of these things, with weed words, depending on how you write and who you are. But an exception doesn't mean you get a pass for all of it. It means you get a pass when appropriate, when intentional, to deliberately do something or write in a specific way. So exceptions are rare, and they're not all the time. So you may make exceptions to anything in here, because it's your book, it's your writing, it's your future, it's your career. But limit the exceptions and do them when they're appropriate, because then someone will ask you, well, why did you describe it this way? Actually, I described it this way because I was trying to do this or give my reader this feeling or emotion. I thought that best relayed how I was going to do that. So then every exception is intentional, and you're really making an intentional decision about each word in each that you put in. That is a weed word, especially in your manuscript. Number 2, show, don't tell. This is one that it took me a long time to understand. I know what it means now because I'm an agent, and I've looked at thousands of books, and ultimately it sticks out really clearly to me now. But it was hard to see in my own writing because of subconscious camouflage. And so show, don't tell. What show, don't tell means is that we show what is happening without telling it. And telling it is we will take a shortcut to try to describe something in one word, usually with an adverb or some other way, or just on the nose kind of writing, when we need to show it within the action, within the dialogue, within the description. And let me give you some hints here. The next would be when we're show, don't tell, we want to eliminate thinking and sensing verbs. This is a good one for us to realize. When you have a thinking verb or a sensing verb, it's always tell. If I say someone's angry, it's a tell. I'm telling you they're angry. I'm not showing you they're angry. So this is a very simple one. If I was an angry speaker, I would be up here and I'd be pounding my chest. I'd be pointing at the audience. I'd be pointing at people. I would be angry and my face would be contorted, my hands, and it'd be forceful actions and emotions. So instead of saying Cyle was an angry speaker as he did the workshop, and you won't say that, you say Cyle pointed at the audience, he pounded the table, he raised his voice, and he drove home the points. So now you're knowing that I'm this angry, forceful speaker by the showing of it. You don't have to use the word angry. So as Cyle spoke the words, he pounded on the table, he pointed right directly at people in the audience and said, you need to write better. That is showing anger, that's showing that forcefulness without ever saying the word angry, because that would be, or angrily, which we see a lot when we see adverbs there. He angrily pointed at the front row. And so those are things that you have to think about. Eliminate anything that's a sense. If you have the 5 senses and you have something describing it and you just use the sense, it's always a tell. If you're touching something and it felt like, that's a tell. And if you're thinking, and if he thought, or he thought, or like about something, Cyle looked at the front row and thought, those people aren't going to make it. So as soon as you tell me he's thinking, you're telling me, instead of showing me the emotions in the scene, how he would feel about the audience by bringing it out and describing that in the writing. And so ultimately, eliminate all thinking and sensing verbs. Anything that you say that's angrily or adverbs or thought or sensed or touched, get all of that out there and just write better, more descriptive scenes where you can see in your mind your readers doing the action, and you get the emotion, you get what they're thinking without ever having to describe the thoughts or the senses. And so that's one of the easiest ways to move from a tell to a show. I can tell you the wind blew forcefully, or I can tell you that, or I can show you the trees swaying and the leaves being blown off, and I can show you all of that, which would tell me the wind is blowing forcefully, which would show me, because I would see it, but you never actually said the wind blew forcefully. I just saw the trees swaying and the leaves blowing everywhere, and ultimately I got it. The wind was blowing forcefully. And that's how we move from tell to show. So make sure that when you're writing, you show, don't tell. And showing, don't tell is a very deep, broad concept. I encourage you, if you struggle with that, take some classes on show, don't tell, where it's really described to you in a way that makes it plain to see. For me, it really took me reading a bunch of other people's writing before I got it. And then one day it just clicked. And I had tried to look at my writing over and over again. I just couldn't see it. And then I started looking at other people's writing. I'm like, oh, I see it everywhere now. And so that's what it took for me. Maybe you need to join more critique groups, read other people's books, and start picking it out for yourself. Because when we name emotions, we're always telling. So don't name emotions. Don't say he was sad, because if you say Cyle was sad, that's telling. Kyle's head drooped to his side, his hands dropped to his side, and he took a deep sigh. That's sad. That's just showing me he's sad, not telling me he's sad. And so those are just a difference. So don't name emotions. It is always a tell when you do that. And so next, after we do that, I like to do, and you can do this one at any point in your manuscript. You can start here. It's what I like to call the backwards miracle. This is a couple different ways. Number one is on the computer. You start at the end of the book, the very end, and you read every sentence from the last sentence forward. Don't start the last word and read every word backwards. That'll just confuse you. But read every sentence from start to finish one at a time from the very end of the book all the way back. And what it does is it allows you to edit each sentence individually for the strength of that sentence, not in context with the rest of the work. Because as you're reading it backwards, the context starts to go away, and so it's a backwards miracle. And so you just start seeing the weaknesses of that sentence because you're really looking at the structure and grammar of the sentence. You're not looking at it in context. It is good and healthy to do it within context, but you want to fix broken sentences first before you work on the context around it. So the backwards miracle, people do this and call me like, that was like genius. I'm like, I didn't make it up. Someone told me at some point, and I started doing it, and I'm like, wow, that really does work. Because it takes away the subconscious camouflage and allows you to trick your mind into seeing the writing for what it is, writing. You can also do this with a document. You can take, say, your Word document, print it out. Instead of looking at it right side up, you can flip it over and look at it upside down. So it's a backwards miracle, but you flip it the upside down miracle. And when you look at it, what happens is you just start looking through it, you'll all of a sudden see adverbs popping out. Like they stick out. There's a light bulb shining right on them. And so you can flip up your document, and depending on how you trick your mind, or you can go on the side, and you can flip it on the side, and you can start seeing them if you print a document out doing it that way. That might look weirder at home if somebody walks in and catches you looking at your computer sideways or hanging upside down to try to look at it. That would be a little bit difficult. Just try it the backwards miracle if you're working on a document on your computer. Next, drop your major league nouns to minor league pronouns. So a lot of us like to use nouns to describe people, places, and things, but we overdo it when you don't always want to use your character's name. So if you said Kyle did and Kyle did and Kyle, it gets really repetitious and boring very quickly, and it's just a sign of weak writing. So if you say Kyle did something, then as long as you're still speaking about Kyle, you can use pronouns. He. So add pronouns in when appropriate to lessen the use of the character's name, because what happens when we first start writing, we overuse the character's name, and there's nothing that I dislike when I read a book and the character's name is just used over and over and over again, because it feels like it's just clunky and it sticks out. Like, I know who the character is. Why do you keep telling me this? And so use pronouns. So drop those down and put them in the minors and just use the pronouns when appropriate. We don't want to overuse pronouns either, which we talked about, because you still have to create strong sentences. So you can't just go from Kyle to he all the way through. You have to restructure your sentences so you don't overuse the character's name or the pronouns, but you want to first try to make a transition to using more pronouns and then work on your sentence structure after that. And one of the tricks to that is just do a character name search. Just search for each character. Do one search at a time. Search for like your main character name. Mine in my fiction is Avo. So I search for Avo, and I just go down and look at every sentence that Avo's in. And again, I zoom out. A lot of these I zoom out. And I zoom out and I see how many times does Avo's name appear on this page and on that page and on that page. And if I think, wow, that's way too many times for his name to appear on a page, my first thing is I go and I look at, okay, can I add more pronouns in and replace the name with pronouns like he and or his? And if I can do that and the sentences still work and are strong, then I start making this switch to pronouns. But then, after I do a name search, after I do all my character name searches, then I go back and I do a pronoun search. He, his, she, her, and depending on what tense you're writing in, and I then look to see, okay, I did the pronouns, but now do I have way too many pronouns? And do I have to go back and restructure sentences to make the sentences stronger, but not by adding back in the character's name. So I don't want to go back to that because I already realized I had too many of those in there. And so it's just this back and forth editing process until you get it. But the more you're doing this, the more you're learning how to write stronger sentences. So on your next book, you're going to start with the ability to write stronger sentences right off the bat because you've fixed all these sentences that needed fixed and you trained yourself through repetition. And so do a character name search. This one is first person issues. I like to write in third person. I don't write a lot of first person, but in first person, the issues are, you may not have the character's name, but you have the words I and my, and they'll appear a lot. And what I see often as an issue in first person instead of character name is the word I and my. And it's usually I. People overuse I. You're going to have a lot more usage of the word I in a first-person book than you're going to have the person's name in a third-person book. It's just the way the writing is different, so you'll need to know and read first-person. There's some really great first-person books. One that I think is written really well without an overuse of the word I is Hunger Games. I think they do a great job in that book. I think she does a great job of structuring that sentences. So there's a lot more use of my than I see in beginning writers, and ultimately in crafting and creating sentences that don't even require them to start with I or my. And so I think that's a great resource to look at if you've never read it. There's others out there that are strong as well. That's just one that sticks out to me. But you want to do the same thing with I and try to replace it with my, and then you go back and then search my and then try to restructure sentences if you have overuse of my as well. So it's just the same thing in first person and third person as you go through. The next one is take the bobble out of your bobbleheads. A lot of our characters are bobblehead characters, which means we say things like our characters smile and shrug or nod. You'll say like Cyle nodded, which is Cyle smiled. And so then we have, if you add those together, which we see a lot, Cyle smiled, nodded, which is a bobblehead character. And so a lot of characters are bobbleheads in books. We make them smile, we make them shrug, I don't know, and we make them nod because we don't know what else to say, or we make them a nod in affirmation, yep. We do things like that, yep, yeah. It's because we don't have a command or grasp of words or usage of words to describe emotions. And so for practice, what you can do is get an emotions thesaurus. There's a really great one by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglish, which is called the emotion thesaurus. They have a negative emotion thesaurus. And so go figure out what emotion you're trying to convey in the scene by having your character smile or nod. And then go to this thesaurus. It'll give you all kinds of ways to describe that emotion that are not shrugging, smiling, nodding, frowning. But when I see characters that frown and smile and nod on the first few pages of a manuscript, I know that it's going to be weak writing throughout the manuscript because that person just does not have a grasp of emotion and how to describe emotion. If they can't do it in the very first pages, they're not going to be able to do it by page 200. And ultimately, it's just not going to be strong enough for me to represent. So those are some of the things I look for that are tell signs of the writing is just not polished to make it in the market at the highest levels of which we need to make it. So those are some things to aware of. So take the bobble out of your bobbleheads, go get you some resources that teach you how to describe emotion, and then figure out the underlying emotion in every scene, and then find better ways to describe it, and you're going to have better, stronger writing at the end of it. And that's just how you take the bobble out of the bobbleheads. Battle the was warriors. Now, I told you earlier that we do the as search. I do the as and the was search at the same time. I just search for the word as, and I find all iterations of both. But battle the was warriors. This is really, I put this in for third person because I like third person, but it'd be the is warriors in first person. How you fix this is when we use the word was, it's to be verb. So really, just get your to be verbs out of your manuscript, because anytime you find am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been, it's weaker writing. And it's going to cause you to write a more passive way and to just do things that are lazier in writing, weaker description, and it's not going to be the best way to describe your scenes. So when you're writing with was or is, go through a search for was or is and start making the sentence stronger when you see them. There's many times I'll see 4 or 5 wases in a paragraph. Sometimes I'll see a couple wases. I'll see an entire paragraph with a sentence that has was or a to be verb in it. And that's just, I know when I see that, the writing is not ready because that is not publishable over and over again in the document. And so search for was and as, and I bet you'll have a ton of them in your document. And it's going to be one of the best ways that you can practice the skills of being a developed writer is by editing those things out and working on those sentences, because by the time you do it, it takes hours. I've done it myself many times. It takes hours to edit those out. But at the end of it, you're going to get an understanding of how to fix weaker sentences by making them stronger and more descriptive. And along with that, when we do the wases, when we find those to be verbs, we're going to find ing words. So we got to pluck the ings off those words. When we see a to be in an ing, especially, it's weaker writing. It's much more passive, and we want to be more active, use more active verbs, more active sentences. And so we want to make sure that we take those ing words and find a better way to describe them, because words that end in ing are generally weaker writing. And so we want to find ways, and you often find them with a comma, because we do these parenthetical phrases, these comma phrases, and all these different ways that we write. But those things should be used infrequently and for intention to say a certain thing a certain way, not in every sentence. And if you've got those comma phrases in every sentence where you start with a phrase with a comma, and you got another phrase, and then you got your end, what you're doing is showing that your grasp of grammar is limited, and you need to expand how different ways to write, describe. And then 27, here I think we got a little bit out of whack here. Oh, check the deep POV. It says different on my screen than it says on your screen. Last one here is check deep POV number 30. Deep POV is when you are in the character's mind. This is popular now, and what has become less popular in some genres is when, especially in third person, where you go to the character has a thought. And so when the character is thinking, characters think in first person. So then you drop into first person, you have the italices, which shows you that the character is now thinking those thoughts. But when you go to italices in first person, you don't put the italics and then put thought Cyle or Cyle thought, because ultimately, by going to the italices, when it's in italics, it is the character in first person thinking. We know that's a given. We don't have to also add the thought. But deep POV allows us to not go into first person and allows us to be inside, close in the character's mind, and have the character have those thoughts and experiences without moving it into moving it from third person into first person, because we still have the same thoughts and experiences of the character, but it's described in such a way as we don't move in and make the character think that. It just is a statement in the text that the character has, and you don't want to go back into thinking and sensing verbs, but it might be just with a sentence with a question mark. What did she say? And that might be your character thinking about what, maybe it's he just told his girlfriend he loved her for the first time, and she's mumbling and crying and under breath, and she's trying to respond, but he thinks, what did she say? You can just say that in third person, and it could just be written as deep POV. I wonder, or some people put, I wonder, what is she saying? And they'll drop that into first person, and you don't need to do that with deep POV. And so there's different levels of closeness. In like third person, you can have distant, you can have close. And so really third person close would be like you're in the character's mind, having the character's thoughts, and you can still describe those in third person, and that would be deep POV. You can also, in first person, you're generally already there and in that deep POV because you're having those experiences and thoughts as you're there with the character. But check deep POV, and you have to be consistent. If you're going to have your character go into first person thoughts, then you're going to need to do that throughout the book. If it all of a sudden appears halfway through the book, it's weird. So you need to be consistent on however you approach that really close thought that your characters are having, whether you move to from third to first or you stay in deep POV. Deep POV is more popular now. I prefer to write with deep POV where I don't go into with my character's thoughts, because mainly I have a dragon who telepathically speaks to my character, and so I use italics for that. And so ultimately that would just confuse my readers. And so sometimes you just stay in that deep POV so you're not confusing your readers, especially if you have multiple characters in scenes who are having different thoughts. If it's a more omniscient viewpoint where you're in everybody's thoughts, it can become very confusing. And so it becomes, how do you grasp deep POV in those kind of settings and scenes? And so really work to understand deep POV. Again, this isn't all about deep POV. I wish I could talk to you a lot more about that. Maybe in a future workshop we can help you with that. But check your deep POV as you're going through and reading on these steps to make sure, are you close enough where you're giving your character's thoughts in the text and allowing us to experience what they're thinking without thinking and sensing verbs. And so this is the 30 steps that I have for my clients to do the polished draft. I hope that this helps you on your manuscript as you edit, as you work on it, as you're trying to create the best fiction you can, or you're using these narrative elements in nonfiction, and really allows you to practice the skills necessary to be a published author. And truthfully, if you do this and you spend the hours and hours it takes to do this well and right, you will be a better author on the other side of your manuscript. Not saying that you'll get a contract tomorrow, but I will say this is how you develop the skills. I do have clients that do this and come back to me in 6 hours and say, I did it. If you did this in 6 hours, you didn't do it. Because to retrain our subconscious is to invest into uncovering that subconscious camouflage with these steps and then making it better and better, investing the time and doing the research with emotions thesaurus to give us the best writing that we can. So hopefully this helps you. Thanks for listening to The Polished Draft.